Lee Marvin was a man who built his name on strength, silence, and a stare so cold it could stop any argument before it started. To the world, he was the perfect Hollywood tough guy, a man who looked like he had walked straight out of a battlefield and onto a movie set. But inside, Lee Marvin carried something heavier than any gun he held on screen. He carried anger, memories, and 6 names that he had never spoken out loud, not to journalists, not to friends, not even to most of his family. These names lived inside him for more than 50 years, like locked doors that he never wanted anyone to open. But in August 1987, when he lay in a hospital bed in Tucson, Arizona, he decided those doors would no longer stay shut. The truth he had held in his chest had grown too heavy. The lies, the betrayals, the humiliation, and the secret wounds that the world never saw had reached a point where silence no longer felt like strength. It felt like poison. And so, 3 days before his death, with tubes in his arms and nurses whispering about how little time he had left, Lee Marvin asked for something unexpected, not medicine, not a priest, not a family meeting. He asked for a tape recorder. At first, his son Christopher thought he wanted to leave a message of love or wisdom, maybe something poetic like many people do near the end of their lives. But that was not what Lee Marvin wanted. When Christopher walked into the room holding the recorder, Lee did not smile, did not soften. He pointed to the machine and said, "Turn it on. I've got names to say." His voice was rough, cracked, but still sharp enough to cut through the air. When the tape began rolling, there was a long moment before he spoke, as if he was calling old ghosts out of the dark corners of his memory. And then, slowly, he listed the names: John Wayne, Charles Bronson, Steve McQueen, Clint Eastwood, Robert Mitchum, and James Coburn. 6 men. 6 legends. 6 people the world adored. But to Lee Marvin, these names represented betrayal, lies, and cruelty. After saying the last name, he did something unexpected. He repeated one of the names again. He said it once. Then twice. Then a third time, each one sounding heavier, deeper, sharper. And then he laughed, not a joyful laugh, but a bitter, broken one. He said, "That bastard. I hated him more than the Germans who shot me. At least they didn't pretend to like me first." Those words shocked his son. They shocked the nurse standing outside the room. And they would have shocked Hollywood if they had ever heard them, but they never did. The family lawyer insisted that the tape should be destroyed. He said it would ruin careers, break families, and tear apart the carefully crafted stories that studios had protected for decades. But not everyone agreed. Lee Marvin's grandson secretly kept a copy of the tape because he believed the truth should not disappear into a locked cabinet. And because of that choice, almost 4 decades later, the world is able to hear the real story behind the anger Marvin hid for most of his life. But before understanding why he hated those 6 men, especially one above all the others, you must understand the moment that pushed him to finally speak. On August 26, 1987, 3 days before his death, the doctor walked into his hospital room with a quiet face and careful words. He told Marvin he had only days left. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. Nothing could be done. Marvin listened without emotion, then asked the nurse for a cigarette. She told him he couldn't smoke in a hospital. Marvin lit it anyway, staring at her with the same cold eyes he used on screen. "What's it gonna do?" he muttered. "Kill me faster." His son sat nearby reading a People magazine featuring an article about Hollywood's toughest stars. Marvin snatched the magazine from him, saw his own picture with the words, "Retired and mellow," and tore the page in half. It was one of the few times his son had seen him lose control. Marvin looked at Christopher and said, "Get me a tape recorder." His voice had no fear in it. It was not the request of a dying man, it was the demand of a soldier preparing for one final mission. And in many ways, it was exactly that. This was not a goodbye. It was a confession. A release. A warning. A truth that had been boiling inside him for too long. According to the nurse who checked on him that night, she could hear him whispering names to himself while staring at the ceiling. Over and over. As if he was calling old enemies to stand in front of him one last time. When Christopher returned with the recorder, the names were already written on Marvin's medical chart, in shaky handwriting and smudged ink. Marvin pointed to them and said, "This is my real autobiography." He pressed the record button himself, adjusted the microphone, took a deep breath, and began. And the first name he told was Charles Bronson. But before diving into that story, he explained something important. He said he never wanted to destroy anyone. He never wanted to expose anyone. He believed in loyalty, privacy, and keeping personal battles personal. But these 6 men had hurt him in ways the public never knew, and now that he was dying, he no longer felt the need to protect them. "These 6, he said, "they carved pieces out of me. And I let them. But I won't die with their lies stuck in my throat." That was the moment the tape changed. That was when the real story began. He said the first betrayal he wanted to talk about happened on the set of a movie that became a classic, but behind the scenes created scars he carried for the rest of his life. He said the man who caused the most damage was silent, cold, and looked like he had no fear. But fear lived deep inside him. That man was Charles Bronson. And before the tape went further, Lee took a long breath, as if preparing to reopen an old wound. Then he began to tell the true story of what really happened on the set of The Dirty Dozen, the story of lies, sabotage, and a friendship that never truly existed. When Lee Marvin began talking about Charles Bronson, his voice on the tape changed. It became tighter, more controlled, the way a man sounds when he is trying to keep old rage from spilling out. He said that when filming began on The Dirty Dozen in 1966, he thought he had found a real friend on set. Bronson had walked up to him during the first week, moving with that quiet, heavy way he had, almost like he was trying to glide past everyone without being noticed. He looked at Marvin, gave a small nod, and said, "We should stick together. 2 real tough guys among all these pretty boys." At that moment, Marvin believed him. Not because Bronson smiled, he rarely did, but because Marvin wanted an ally. He had already had problems with John Wayne years earlier, and he knew Hollywood was full of people who would smile at you during the day and stab you in the back at night. So Bronson's offer felt like a small piece of safety. They talked between scenes. They compared stories. Marvin told him real war stories, stories from the Pacific, stories from nights filled with gunfire, explosions, and wounded soldiers crying out for help. Bronson told stories too, but Marvin always felt something odd about them, as if they were half true or stitched together from things he had heard other people say. Still, Marvin ignored that feeling because he thought Bronson respected him. He even taught Bronson how to hold a rifle properly, how to make the recoil look real, how to walk like someone who had carried 50 pounds of gear through mud. Bronson listened carefully, nodded politely, and acted like a man grateful for guidance. But Marvin said that while he was helping Bronson become more believable on screen, Bronson was quietly working behind the scenes to tear him down. The first signs were small. In one scene, Bronson stepped into the camera frame at the wrong moment, blocking Marvin's close-up. Marvin thought it was an accident. In another take, Bronson coughed loudly while Marvin delivered an important line. Again, he said nothing. And then there was the fight scene. It was supposed to be a staged hit, a light elbow for the camera. But Bronson slammed his elbow into Marvin's jaw so hard that Marvin almost fell. The assistant director hurried over. That day was the first time someone pulled Marvin aside and said, "Hey, Bronson told me you've been drinking again." Marvin said that when he heard that, he went silent. He hadn't touched alcohol for 6 months. Not a sip. He had been working hard to stay clean, to keep his reputation steady, and to prove that he wasn't the stereotype of a tough actor who drank too much. But according to the assistant director, Bronson had told half the crew that Marvin was secretly drinking. And because Marvin often looked tired after 16-hour days, people believed it. The worst moment came one evening after shooting. Marvin had been working since sunrise, barely able to keep his eyes open. Bronson walked over, put a hand on his arm, and pretended to help him back to his trailer. To anyone watching, it looked like Bronson was helping a drunk man walk. A few crew members saw it. One took a photograph. The next day, British newspapers were already printing stories with dramatic headlines, "Marvin meltdown. The drunk dozen." Lee's Last Stand. Marvin said that these articles spread across England like fire. And Bronson watched it all without saying a word. He didn't correct anyone. He didn't defend Marvin. He didn't tell people the truth, that Marvin was sober, exhausted, and betrayed. Instead, he kept reading the newspapers with a blank, quiet expression, as if the chaos didn't affect him at all. Marvin said that when he finally confronted Bronson, he found him sitting calmly in his trailer reading one of those papers. Marvin stood in the doorway and said, "Charlie." No answer. He said it again. Still nothing. He walked inside and said, "Charles." Finally, Bronson lifted his eyes, slowly, like a machine turning on. Marvin told him they needed to talk about the rumors. Bronson tilted his head and said, "What rumors, Lee?" That was the moment Marvin realized something painful. Bronson wasn't tough. He wasn't strong. He wasn't quiet because he was mysterious. He was quiet because there was nothing behind the silence, no loyalty, no friendship, no honesty. Just emptiness and ambition. Marvin said his anger exploded. He grabbed the nearest bottle, Bronson's bottle of scotch, smashed it against the wall, and pointed the jagged glass at Bronson. It wasn't because he wanted to hurt him. It was because he wanted Bronson to feel something, anything. Fear, guilt, regret. But Bronson didn't move. He just whispered, "You're crazy." And Marvin said, "No, Charlie. I'm honest. That's why you're scared." Production was almost shut down that day. The producer, Kenneth Hyman, flew in from London to control the damage. Newspapers were paid off. Lawyers got involved. Marvin was forced to sign a non-disclosure agreement that prevented him from speaking about the incident. And to Marvin's disgust, Bronson got a raise for helping keep the film on schedule. Years later, 3 crew members admitted privately that they had seen Bronson calling gossip columnists, feeding them stories about Marvin's supposed drinking. One grip, Tommy Morrison, kept a journal. His daughter mailed it to Marvin in 1983. Marvin said he remembered sitting alone reading the entry from August 15, 1966. It said, "Bronson spreading lies about Marvin. Everyone knows. No one says anything. This business is built on cowards." Marvin said those words hit him harder than Bronson's elbow ever did. After the Dirty Dozen, Marvin refused to work with Bronson again. He turned down 3 films that would have paid him nearly $2 million. But he didn't care. He said the money wasn't worth the sickness he felt when he thought about Bronson's face. He said hatred wasn't something he liked carrying, but it was something Bronson had earned. And yet, the strangest part of Bronson's story came at the end of Marvin's recording. He talked about how Bronson died in 2003, suffering from Alzheimer's, unable to remember people, places, or even his own name. Marvin said that when he first heard the news, long before he knew he was dying, he didn't celebrate it, didn't smile, didn't cheer. Instead, he felt something cold and empty, as if the universe had punished Bronson in a way Marvin never could. He spent his life hiding behind silence, Marvin said, and in the end, silence swallowed him whole. And after finishing Bronson's story, Marvin paused on the tape. It was the longest pause so far. You could hear him breathing. You could hear the hospital machines beeping softly in the background. Then he said, "But Bronson wasn't the only one. Not by a long shot. There were 5 more. 5 men who taught me that Hollywood isn't a home. It's a battlefield." And that was when he turned to the next name, the one everyone thought he admired. But the truth was much darker. As the years passed, the anger inside Lee Marvin did not come from only one person or one event. It slowly grew from a series of moments, disappointments, and betrayals that piled up like heavy stones on his shoulders. In the beginning, Marvin entered Hollywood with simple hopes. He wanted to act, to tell stories, and to make a good life doing something he loved. He had survived war, hardship, and the difficulty of finding his place in the world. Acting felt like a fresh start. But Hollywood was never a place of pure loyalty. It was a world where people smiled at you in the morning and pushed you aside by the afternoon. And slowly, Marvin learned this truth the hard way. One of the deepest wounds came from a man he once called a brother. This friend learned Marvin's acting tricks, his tone, his pauses, the way he used silence to create tension, and then began copying them. At first, Marvin laughed it off. He thought it was a joke or even a compliment. But soon he noticed casting directors saying things like, "We already have someone who performs like you," or, "Your style isn't as new as it once was." That hurt him deeply because he knew where they had learned that style. It felt like someone had walked into his home, taken something precious, and sold it as their own. And when Marvin confronted the man, expecting honesty or at least regret, he was met with coldness. The friend shrugged and said, "It's just business." That phrase stayed in Marvin's head for years. Just business. It was the excuse people used when they wanted to do something cruel without feeling guilt. Marvin wrote in his diary that those two words changed how he saw Hollywood forever. Another painful betrayal involved a colleague he had once helped rise through the industry. Marvin opened doors for this man, introduced him to agents, and even helped him fix mistakes that could have ruined his early career. But once the man became famous, he turned his back on Marvin completely. He stopped returning calls, pretended not to know Marvin in public, and even spread rumors that Marvin was difficult to work with. These lies affected Marvin's reputation and made producers cautious about hiring him. The worst part wasn't the rumors, it was the feeling of being used and abandoned. Marvin wrote that this betrayal felt like a knife from someone whose hand I once held steady. These emotional wounds began to show in the way Marvin acted on set. He became quieter, more guarded. He didn't trust easily, and he rarely let people get close to him. Some co-stars believed he was cold or unfriendly, but the truth was that Marvin was protecting himself. He didn't want to give anyone the chance to hurt him again. But his diary shows that even behind his tough exterior, he felt lonely. He often wrote about wishing he had real friends who cared about him as a person, not just as a famous actor who could help them. Hollywood's fake friendships drained him emotionally. Yet Marvin was not perfect either. He had moments where his anger got the best of him. Once, during a film shoot, he confronted someone who had spread lies about him. The argument became so heated that the director had to stop filming for the rest of the day. Marvin felt embarrassed afterward and wrote in his diary that he wished he had handled it differently. His rage was not only about others, it was also a fight within himself. But the breaking point, the event that truly ignited the fury in Marvin's diary, came during a role he had prepared for months. It was supposed to be one of the most important roles of his career. He studied day and night, worked with a coach, changed his voice, adjusted his walk, and dedicated himself fully. But just before filming began, he learned that the role had been given to the same man who once copied his acting style, the same man Marvin once trusted. And the reason? The studio believed the other actor was a younger, fresher version of Marvin. That sentence shattered him. He felt replaced, erased, and betrayed in a way he couldn't hide anymore. He later wrote that it was the first time in his life he understood why some people break completely under pressure. Marvin didn't break, but he came close. For months afterward, he barely spoke to anyone. He avoided events, interviews, and public appearances. His friends said he seemed like a man wandering through a fog he couldn't escape. Acting, which once brought him joy, now felt like a battlefield filled with hidden traps. Hollywood was no longer his dream, it was a cage. But despite everything, Marvin continued working. He used his pain to deepen his performances. Some fans even say his best roles came from the period after these betrayals, when he let his real emotions pour into every scene. His anger, sadness, and disappointment made him more human, more believable, and more powerful on screen. The diary shows that Marvin was not simply angry at one person. His hatred came from years of disrespect, manipulation, and dishonesty. He believed that the industry rewarded the loudest voices, not the most loyal people. He believed that real friendships in Hollywood were nearly impossible. And above all, he believed that fame was a dangerous illusion that cost him more than it ever gave. Yet even with all the negativity, the final pages of the diary show a man who still hoped for peace. Marvin wrote that he wished he could let go of the resentment one day. He hoped he could forgive, or at least forget. But he admitted that some wounds go too deep to heal completely. His last message in the diary said, "I only wanted people to see me, not the version they could use." These words reveal the core of Marvin's pain. Beneath the anger was a man who wanted respect, honesty, and human connection. He wanted loyalty in a world that rewarded betrayal. And because he rarely spoke about these feelings in interviews or public spaces, his diary is the only place where we see his real heart, hurt, guarded, and longing for truth. As we explore more of Marvin's story, we learn that the anger he carried was not just a reaction to Hollywood. It was part of his personal journey, shaped by childhood experiences, war memories, broken trust, and the feeling of being misunderstood. His diary offers a window into a soul burdened by secrets, expectations, and disappointments. And even decades later, reading his words still makes you feel his pain as if it happened yesterday.